Ready when you are.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Matteo Monti, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, and it is my pleasure today to welcome you to this STALS book presentation. STALS is a project coordinated by Giuseppe Martinico, Giacomo Delle Donne, and Filippo Fontanelli, and this event is part of the Jean Monnet Chair Apex, Adapting and Protecting European Constitutional Law in Times of Illiberal Populism, and it is jointly organized with the Eurac Research Center in Bozen, Bolzano. So in today's webinar, we are really happy and glad to present the book Fiscal Federalism and Diversity Accommodation in Multilevel States, a Comparative Outlook, edited by Alice Valdesalici and Francisco Javier Romero Caro, who are both researchers at Eurac Research in Bozen, Bolzano. So let me briefly explain the format of today's event. First, the two editors will introduce the main, let's say, topics and contributions of the book. After that, our two discussants will offer their reflections and comments and remarks on the book. And we are very pleased to have Professor Yonatan Fessha and Professor Maribel González Pascual joining us today as discussants. After these interventions and the editor's reaction, we will open the floor for a Q&A session with the audience. So before we begin, a few brief rules of the game. The webinar is being recorded, so if you prefer to not appear, please switch off your camera, and please keep your microphones muted during the presentations of the different speakers. And we will address as many questions as possible during the final Q&A session. So without further ado, let me invite our speakers to begin. And our first speaker is Francisco Javier Romero Caro. Francisco, thank you again for accepting our invitation, and congratulations on the public.
Okay, so thank you very much to STALS, to Matteo, to Giuseppe, to Giacomo for the invitation, and also for this collaboration that we look forward to continue in the future. Yeah, let me explain a bit the history behind the book, this one, so that we have here. So how it started, and let's say why this book is an end, but also a beginning. So yeah, this book is the final product of a project called DATE, Diversity Accommodation Through Territorial Equalization. And this was a project that we submitted for a Marie Curie, and that obtained the Seal of Excellence, and then was kindly funded by the Province of Bolzano Bozen. And the idea behind this is that I wanted to explore the link between fiscal federalism and diversity accommodation. I had already experience in diversity accommodation in Canada and in Spain, and I had already started doing research on how fiscal instruments can be tools for diversity accommodation. And I was interested especially in this contrast because in Canada you have a subnational unit, Quebec, that is poorer than the average and that therefore receives equalization payments. And since the Second World War, fiscal instruments were used as a tool to try to integrate the distinctiveness of Quebec within Canada, while, for example, in a different country, in Spain, you have both Catalonia, the Basque Country, that are richer than the average and then therefore contribute to the system, especially the case of Catalonia, not that of the Basque Country, but that has a special system of territorial financing and financing per capita way over the average. So I thought that there was something there, something worth exploring, and then this is why this project. So basically, this project tried to explore from a constitutional and comparative point of view the role of fiscal arrangements as tools of territorial integration, determining to which extent equalization mechanisms can be conceived as an instrument to reduce territorial tensions and to accommodate diversity, all following this idea that equalization mechanisms are an instrument to hold the country together, and that they are, let's say, they have a sense of solidarity embedded in themselves that it's important to study. So yeah, the idea was to explore the integrative and the disintegrative potential of these mechanisms in subunits that either have experience or are experiencing a secessionist challenge, in order to determine if and to which extent they work in a way that fosters integration, or rather the opposite. So basically the idea was to bring together the first generation, the second generation of fiscal federalism, and also for this idea of integration, disintegration, building on the literature on European integration. And so the project developed a set of indicators, in particular 7 indicators for the, let's say, a benchmark for the purpose of comparison. And these 7 indicators are there applied to the 3 case studies that originally were Canada, Spain, and the United Kingdom. Canada, that the results were published in an article on perspective on federalism, and for example, the case of the UK is the one that we have in the book, and that I will talk now a bit about it. Basically, these 7 indicators are drawn from the internal architecture of equalization mechanisms, and they are the legal entrenchment of the program. So if it's embedded in the constitution, in a legal statute, if there is an informal consensus, and this leads to different potentials of integration or disintegration. Same thing for the nature of the redistribution, taking into account if equalization is vertical, if it's horizontal, if we are in presence of a receiving subunit or a not receiving subunit, if it's an open or a closed system, if it's integrated or a standalone program. So if all subunits get transfers, that could be the case of Spain or Germany, or if it's just a program in which certain territories qualify, as could be the case of Canada. The level and component of equalization. So if we are talking about partial equalization, if we are talking about full equalization based on revenue, based on needs, etc. If equalization payments are conditional, and if so, this is soft or hard conditionality. The administering of the program, if this is done through an independent agency, like the paradigmatic case of Australia, or through an intergovernmental forum. And here, for example, we distinguish if there is a strong federal culture or let's say, soft federal culture, or if this is done simply by a central agency. And of course, this leads to different potential of integration and disintegration. Same thing, for example, for the length of the program. If we have, normally these programs are approved for a certain amount of years, so they contain sunset clauses, but then they can have, let's say, ultra activity clauses. For example, Spain would be here the paradigmatic example. System was designed to last until 2014, but still applicable because it has not been reformed. Same thing finally for the final element, dispute resolution, if these issues are merely a political question, or if they can be referred to an intergovernmental forum, or to a supreme, or to a constitutional. So this is basically the benchmark, and this was tried to be applied to different realities. One of them being the United Kingdom, that is the one that you find in one of the chapters of the book that I will now address. So the idea basically by doing that is to illustrate how the territorial funding arrangement of the United Kingdom, namely the Barnett formula, can be considered as a holding together tool, because it has allowed for greater public spending per capita in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, that what it would be justified by their population. And although spending per capita has converged slowly in time, this is a system of unconditional funding. So again, achieving integration. And as I said, this convergence has been slower than expected, especially because of the many formula bypasses that we have seen. So what we see in this chapter is that the flexibility that the UK territorial funding arrangement has allowed to cultivate a sense of belonging to the common polity of the United Kingdom, at the expense actually of creating some resentment in England, especially in the regions in the north that are poorer than the rest of the UK. And this holds particularly true in Scotland, where the UK government tries to display the overfunding of the territory as one of the benefits of the union. And actually, it's no surprise that the Scottish government, even under SNP governments, have never been in favor of replacing the Barnett formula with a needs system like in Australia, for example, as this would lead to a reduction of the per capita funding in that. Probably one of the most striking findings of this chapter is that the disintegrative potential that the system has applies especially to the English regions that are in a disadvantaged position in comparison to the devolved nations. One can think, for example, of the funding floor for Wales on 115% of the spending per capita. Therefore, the system have developed legal mechanisms to enshrine difference and to, let's say, hold the country together and show the benefits of the union. And actually, the success of the Barnett formula has so far exceeded the initial expectations, allocating only funding between the nations, and even with some shortcomings regarding, for example, dispute resolution, because His Majesty's Treasury is judge and jury in this regard, the system has worked quite. So I said before that this book was, let's say, a start and let's say an end and also a beginning. An end because the book was the final product of the project. So during the project, we have a series of workshops, of online seminars, because it was still the times of the pandemic, so we couldn't do them in person, in which we reflected on this topic and we gathered basically the chapters that are the backbone of the book. So the idea was to illustrate how in different realities around the world, fiscal federalism can be an instrument to integrate diversity. Diversity understood in a very, very broad sense. Diversity as diversity, for example, in income, or by diversity also different sizing units with different powers, with different ethnical compositions, or, for example, the presence of indigenous peoples, as could be the case of Canada or of Australia, as we can find in different chapters of the book. So this was the end of the project, but also a beginning. Why a beginning? Because this also inaugurated, let's say, or consolidated an area of research at the Institute by both Alicia and myself, in which we got interested by further exploring, further advancing this link between fiscal federalism and diversity accommodation. Originally equalization mechanisms, as I said, but not exclusively, also the spending power. So how these values impact the federal equilibrium. So how these notions can be connected and can be interlinked, and how together they affect the generally conflicts within a federal system, if these conflicts are managed within the boundaries of the federal system, if these conflicts are let's say channeled outside of the federal system. So I know Alicia will talk a bit more on this. So this was the idea that we had while editing this book, and this is what we tried to do, what the project tried to do, and what we will try to keep doing in the future. So the idea of keep exploring the link between fiscal federalism and between diversity accommodation, something that has been understudied so far, and that we think that it has some potential for better understanding how multi-level systems, federal systems in a very broad sense, can integrate diversity and can, let's say, foster integration, diminishing the risk for secession or for free rider behavior within multi-level systems. And with this, I will hand over to Alicia, that I'm sure she has very interesting things to say.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for such an excellent introduction and for setting the stage so clearly, and also for your insightful remarks on the UK system and the Barnett formula. So let me now turn to Alice Valdesalici, who is one of the leading experts, I believe, on fiscal federalism. And Alice will take us further into the discussion and reflect on some of the dimensions of this book and more generally, I believe, on fiscal federalism. So again, thank you, Alice, for accepting our invitation, and congratulations on the publication of the book. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Matteo, for the introduction and for the words you expressed. Thanks a lot. But also I would like to thank our friends and colleagues of STALS, so Giuseppe and Giacomo, for accepting organizing this event. And also allow me to thank my colleague Francisco Javier for involving me in this project, because it expanded the borders of my research on fiscal federalism quite a lot, because as you mentioned at the beginning, I mostly deal with financial relations, and I struggled a bit to expand this new vision and to integrate this new approach into fiscal federalism. But now, also looking at the book again, I see that this is a rather interesting and challenging topic that is worth further exploration. And so, to connect it to this further exploration, I decided to focus my presentation on a few comparative insights that emerge from the book, and in particular from the 8 case studies that are addressed by the book. Just because they might just prepare the floor for additional research on the topic, so for further reflection on this issue. One general premise. The comparative observation of the cases within the book confirm what the basic assumption behind this research is. That is, financial relations are not only a system of resource allocation. This emerges clearly. It emerges that it's a key constitutional mechanism, a key constitutional architecture, a key constitutional political choice, among other things, for managing diversities. And I would use the plural on purpose, as my colleague did at the beginning. But I would like to focus on at least 3 structural issues in order to understand, or at least to try to discuss on how and to what extent this relation works, the link between financial relation and fiscal federalism is translated into practice in the case studies. And in particular, I would like to focus on these following 3 elements: the cause and effect affair, I call it, it's a relation, of course, the balance affair, and the participation affair. This is what we used to group them in the book. Sorry. As to the first comparative sides, the relation. Of course, there is a relation between diversity and a given fiscal design. Diversity shapes the architecture, the fiscal architecture. But the issue here is rather complicated, in the sense that it's not a cause and effect relation. It's better to talk about maybe a cause and effect illusion, because there is no linear relation between these 2 elements. I explain a bit more why this happens. There is at least a correlation, so there is a nexus, but this is too complex because we mentioned, by using the plural, diversities. So diversity is frequently never singular. especially when it comes, when it comes to a single case studies. If we have a look at the 8 case studies in the country, most of them show a combination, a different configuration of diversities, but a combination, a layering of diversity, a multi-dimension in terms of diversity. And what is interesting is also that if you have a look at how diversity are distributed within a country, you see that they are unevenly distributed. So you can find single entities with combined economic and for instance, identity-related diversities, but others in which it's just a matter of economics. They are maybe poor country with no identity-related issues concentrated within a given government. So uneven distribution, this is another issue, and it's important to understand the relation. And this holds particularly when it comes to symmetric system, symmetric financial arrangement, in which this uneven distribution is not accommodated in a way. Another issue that complicate the scene is due to the fact that financial arrangements are not only the results of diversity accommodation, are not only influenced by diversity accommodation, but there are many other factors that have a role. Things about history, constitutional tradition, nation building strategies, geography, and also, and this is very, very much important, financial relations are also the outcome of how diversity is politically constructed. They are the results of the political compromise and of political narratives. This means that there is a correlation between diversity and a given financial arrangement, yes, but it's difficult to, there is no one-to-one corresponding. It's not a cause-effect relation. And then what is interesting is that frequently, because of this complexity, this layering of diversity, one argument can hide or cause another. I make you some examples. Economic argument may be used to hide political interest. This is the case of Australia. In Australia, there has been a move from full to reasonable equalization. It's ongoing, so the reform has been approved, but it's still an ongoing process. But if you have a look at who pushed for the change, you find that Western Australia was pushing for the change, and the state said, okay, we need to change this because the system as it is inefficient. But then if you have a look, there is also another factors that comes to the fore that it's not the main argument used. And this is the fact that Western Australia is losing under this full equalization mechanism too much resources. It's a rich state, and out of this full equalization mechanism, the state is losing too many resources. So there are two arguments, and one hide the others. The same happens in case of Spain, for instance. In Spain, there is an equalization mechanism, and the formula, there are many equalization funds, but one of these is based on population, but there are many factors that are used to apply to correct the population. So the population is corrected through many factors that are all sum up in a formula. And what happened in reality is that the storytelling is that they respond to economic rationality, but actually they hide the territorial interest. This means that each autonomous community, depending on its specific features, pushed for adding one correction instead of the other, depending on territorial interest. So the idea is that one argument can hide or cause another one. So again, it's difficult to understand the relationship between a given diversity and the resulting financial arrangement. The second issue that I want to focus is the balance affair. This is because every financial constitution is the result of a balance between autonomy and solidarity. And we could say that it's based on two main pillars: fiscal autonomy and financial equalization and intergovernmental grants in general. From a theoretical perspective, one would expect that when there is the need to accommodate identity-related diversity that is also territorially concentrated, I would expect greater self-government and greater fiscal autonomy. Contrary-wise, when there is more emphasis on economic disparities, I would expect a system that favors equalization. But reality, including the case we have analyzed, shows the opposite. Most of the cases are fiscally centralized. So among the cases analyzed in the book, only Canada and to a limited extent Spain recognize subnational government a significant fiscal autonomy. So what happens is that in most of the cases, intergovernmental grants and equalization mechanism in particular play a key role. And this happens both when diversity is primarily of economic nature, but also when diversity is linked to identity factor, especially if this, of course, overlaps with economic diversities. But still, this is the predominant feature in all the systems. So we have a correlation somehow, because in some cases, asymmetric fiscal arrangements are granted to territories in which we have identity diversity factor related and concentrated into a specific territory, that if it's reached, then it's granted with a bit more fiscal autonomy. Think about the case of Scotland that asked for and obtained let's say an increased fiscal autonomy with the tartan tax. Is it the tartan tax bill and Scotland Act? Is it the Scotland Act, Francisco? Scotland Act, sorry. So it happens, there is a sort of a correlation at times, but this correlation is anyway pretty loose because diversity influences but doesn't determine the final fiscal design. So among other factors, it has a say, it has a role, but it's not the determinant of the result. And this brings me to the last point I would like to focus on, that is the participation, what I call the participation affair. Because we have an issue here, because fiscal design, in a way, accommodate diversity, yes, in a way, but at the same time, every fiscal balance, every fiscal design inevitably generate tension. This is because financial relations are conflictual by natures. We have, just to put it very simply, richer region that wants typically less redistribution, poor region that wants more redistribution, just to mention one conflict that might raise. And here, what has emerged in another paper that Francisco and I worked on is that anyway, there is we have like a sort of basic assumption that is the following: when subnational government participate effectively in shaping the rules of the game, in shaping the financial arrangement, these arrangements are more likely to be perceived as legitimate, and in a way the acceptance of the rules of the game is comparatively higher. So we don't mean with that contestation do not exist, but typically these contestations remain within the constitutional boundaries. And if we move to the cases we have discussed in the book, we see in fact different forms of participation. We see cases in which participation is strong and institutionalized, like in Canada. We see cases in which it's informal but still meaningful, like in, sorry, the first case was Australia and the second one is Canada. But we also see that in many cases, participation is weak or structurally constrained. And one interesting case is, for instance, Spain, in which we have multilateral institution, but within this institution, the central government dominates the scenes. And what's the matter here? The matter is that when fiscal arrangements are centrally imposed, so the rules are not agreed together, fiscal conflicts are more likely to spill beyond the constitutional borders and subnational governments are more likely to resort to extra-constitutional form of contestation of the existing rules. And for instance, when it comes to the book cases, we see this dynamic in the India case, that's in the India chapter and also in the Spain chapter. So the idea is that there is a link between fiscal federalism and diversity accommodation. Yes, there is, but the effectiveness of fiscal federalism in accommodating diversity is only partial, because a given financial arrangement can contribute to the accommodation of diversity, but underlying tension remains, are not eliminated. And to a certain extent, I have to warn that financial arrangement can even amplify underlying tension, because financial arrangement can work both as a generator of conflicts as well as a mechanism for managing conflict. So effectiveness of fiscal federalism in accommodating diversity is not only a matter of balanced design, but also a matter of acceptance of the rules of the game. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alice, for those fascinating reconstruction, as well for the comparative overview and for highlighting those important trends and patterns across the different experiences. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Maribel González Pascual, who is professor at the Pompeu Fabra University. Maribel, we look forward to hearing your reflections on the book, and please, the floor is yours. And thank you for accepting our invitation, of course.
No, thank you for inviting me. Okay. I want to congratulate the editors of the book, as I said before, and the publication, obviously to the authors, but particularly to the editors, because this is an understanding topic. It has been much written about diversity as a driving force for the creation of a federal state or for the devolution, but has been written a lot about the symmetry in which these new federal states of devolution process usually, but not much has been written apart from it about diversity and fiscal diversity and fiscal federalism. This book, Fiscal Federalism, is a study with two goals, which the editors make explicit at the beginning. It says how much diversity has affected intergovernmental fiscal relations, but also inquires onto what extent fiscal federalism has had an impact in accommodating diversity. The first goal, I would say, is common currency, when we talk about fiscal arrangements and federal asymmetry, so to say, but not the second. And both goals are achieved by the selected cases. And this is, for me, the great merit of the book, because it addresses really very deep cases, but they are pertinent. They have different kind of asymmetries, but also very different historical context. In this sense, the book reminds us again in several chapters of the importance of the rules, of the reason for that model of the state and with that precise design. A key analysis, because quite often the satisfaction with the design, with the asymmetries, with the recognition of the difference is caused because we have forgotten. We forget why we chose that path. We forget the reason why a state was a federal state and why it is decentralized in a certain way. But as Michael Burgers explained, why we chose that path is even today a key issue in many cases. Novel, the goals, cases that are very pertinent and clear and are quite systematic throughout the chapters, with the first general chapter, the chapter of Bruegger and Montes Nevada, with the main concepts that will accompany us throughout the book are explained, and the guidelines for measuring fiscal decentralization are given. And this is particularly useful for any reader. And most of the readers that, like myself, serve the wonderful quote of Donald Smiling in the chapter related to Canada that says, I think it's a wonderful statement. I have nothing to say about fiscal federalism, as such which one has tried to comprehend, but which is so complicated that one should either cultivate it as a full-time specialty, or leave it alone entirely. Even the ones that might feel like myself that they will completely be lost, they will learn a lot from all the chapters and find new avenues for diversity. Which elements would I highlight from the several chapters? Not that I know I'm influenced by my own context, my country, my influence as researchers, my work in the recent years, so that has influenced how I understand the book. Well, I say that on the one hand, both of the chapters highlight the need of two threads of research: the issue of equalization and fiscal federalism influence on minority nationalists. Two threads that are often separated as in the political discourse and the narrative that must go hand in hand. Given that both the balance high income and low income state plus the empowerment or disempowerment of internal minority national communities are essential for the federal state, for the constitutional state as a framework in which we all feel represented. At the end of the day, each financial constitution is a balance between autonomy and solidarity, and this is done through different instruments. Then the fiscal arrangement has to take into account the standard of equivalent conditions right to territory, the quality of enjoyment of constitutional rights. So this is a quality that the Constitution defines in different ways. In fact, as I expected, in most of the cases that are studied, the raison d'etre of the federalism is accommodating diversity. It is this bringing together. But to my surprise, the book includes cases inspired more by the United States federalism coming together that would be aspiring for instance. Nonetheless, both cases are actually really pertinent because there are deep asymmetries in both countries that should be fundamental to the tax system and that remind us of all the goals that the fiscal federalism has achieved in all the cases, which is solidarity. The tax capacity across territories should not be translated into large differences in access to and quality of public services. Throughout the territory, the system must be perceived as a fair one. Still, as I said, the fiscal arrangement must foster equality, but in a wise sense, because equality is also the same right to be different from the perspective of democratic principle in words of Maribel. So I always enjoyed this quote of Dorothy. It was very different for my research. That was a political community must treat all its members as equals. That is, with equal concern and respect, and it must respect the sovereign requirement not only in its design of economic institutions and practices, but its conception of freedom, of community, and of political democracy as well. So the achievement is so complex and in too many cases unattainable goals, I would add, does not rest only on the shoulders of the fiscal federalism that have been pointed by Alberto. And surprisingly, in all the chapters, they propose a broader scope. The Italian chapter does it explicitly, in which it considers the political avenues and constitutional mechanisms that allow the representation and participation of the states of regions, especially if they have a clear aspiration to self-government. I would say that at this point, the chapter devoted to India presents us with the most radical scenario. I would have to say I love that chapter. It's very long, it's very complex, but you actually understand the case. It's not an easy task. The outbreak of a deep crisis, I would say an existential crisis for the state itself, does not only derive from economic differences, does not only derive from the perception of economic injustice plus cultural dimension, but it ignites when the inability of the state to provide institutional channels for expressing this content is Sant'Anna. That's the precise moment, not the tipping point. That twin catalyst thesis of the chapter. So the first catalyst is the economic deprivation of a minority that is the majority with the statistics, and the second is the failure of the political avenue to address the difference. No? This tipping point of what is called institutional decay. No? When the political process fails to provide a platform for the expression of the discontent. That Perhaps it not be surprising because having a voice, participation, is also decided. It is the democratic principle. Therefore, fiscal federalism has complex and clear objectives to integrate the parts into a whole, to make them feel that they are all treated fairly without forgetting the differences that characterize them, which in many cases is the right of the federalists, and the representation and participation in the development and ongoing management of fiscal relations of the regions and in the main political decisions of the country must also be considered in the treatment of those goals. The participation as an integrated force that contributes to reducing territorial tension, as in the chapter on the UK states, it strengthens the ties between the governments and promotes dialogue and cooperation. Other chapters also add the need to consider the system of competences, which is in line with what was manifested in research on the quality to our territory, taking into account who rules on constitutional rights and the provision of fundamental principles, which is, for instance, the actual understanding of equality in a precise community, along the European integration in cases such as the Spanish or the Italian one. And I would say that in both cases, they're right. It's totally pertinent. Decentralization cannot be understood without the EU membership, both because of the elements of the tax system that it can determine, but also by its own influence on the economic policy of the member states in wise sense. Let's just remember the Euro crisis and the pandemic that derived in the mechanism of recovery and resilience and what that has meant for the regions in both cases. By the way, now that I mentioned the EU, for me it has been illuminated the role that in all the chapters play the nature of the conditions associated with transference. A key issue now with the EU is what is so important for the relationship between the EU and the member states, for the future of the integration, the degree of conditionality of the transfer, it is highlighted in all the chapters, particularly clear in the chapter on the UK. Are there transfers, which is the goal? Is there to decide how to develop or implement it, to participate in their design? Are there strings attached? If there are, normally there are, do they attend properly to the distribution of powers? In the same way as the transfers can allow or impede the self-government in a federal state, they can affect the integration of the member states. Those questions must be addressed before design of the system of transfer, because its impact upon the deeper integration or the opposite, upon the wider risk from the primary variables. So in this regard, books like the one that we are discussing today also shed light on this European debate that goes beyond the regionalism. To come to an end, I'm not going to talk about. I would remind that the fiscal constitution is vital for the success of failure of the federal regional process. The lack of resources to finance constitutionally assigned powers, reduce autonomy to an vessel. Besides, a certain degree of redistribution through an equalization mechanism is also vital for the future of the regional federal process to hold together or to come together. In this framework, I wonder which influence might have the welfare states in every community. If there is a strong welfare state, a well-financed international interpersonal solidarity or not, if there is a collective support for it or there is not. So that's what I mean, what the idea of equality society has. I'm not an expert on financial constitution, but my hunch is that the place that the welfare state plays for a community and how it actually works will be essential for the distribution of resources among the territorial unions and among the state and territorial unions. I want to remark that I have said federal regional process more and much not by chance, because the balance must be kept over time, as we in the last chapter, remember. This balance is the result of permanent dialogue, and it must be so, because differentiation belongs to the essence of the federal system, because there will never be complete satisfaction of all the players involved in a financial arrangement, because not only the economic circumstances change, but they do, the international framework can change radically. We are witnessing it. There's always a crisis around the corner in the last years that has affected the equilibrium within federal and regional states. The idea of equality can also change with our society, and even the understanding of diversity as a common value can be rewritten. So I do not want to put an end with a pessimist tone. The ones who know me know it is not my nature. So I would simply say thanks for counting with me, because I have learned a lot within the book, food for thought, I would say. I would recommend the reading also for the ones like me, who might consider at the beginning that they will not understand it, because fiscal constitution is an extremely complicated matter. The book is beautifully written, very coordinated, and anyone interested in federalism in wide sense will find good ideas for their own work. So thanks, and hold on to all the ones who participated in the book.
Thank you very much, Maribel, for those very interesting remarks. And our second discussant is Yonatan Fessha, professor at the University of the Western Cape in Cape Town, whose work many of us know for its important contribution to comparative federalism and secession. And Yonatan, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to thank the host for inviting me, but I also want to congratulate the editors of the book. When I received the invitation, or when I accepted the invitation to comment, to join the discussion about the book, I did not immediately appreciate that I was entering into somewhat difficult territory. My work focused mainly on the constitutional or institutional accommodation of diversity. And that's probably the reason why I was invited to join the discussion, and also the reason I accepted the invitation somewhat, I think, impulsively. Because as I began reading the chapters, I was reminded of a remark made by the leading Canadian political scientist, Donald Smile, which is also, I think, quoted in the book, which I think also mentioned by Maribel now, where he suggested that fiscal federalism is such a complicated subject that one should either cultivate it as a full-time specialty or leave it alone entirely. And that's what I did. I left it alone entirely when I wrote my own book on ethnic diversity and federalism, because I openly acknowledged that although fiscal powers are crucial, because autonomy without financial resources is meaningless, is hollow, I still indicated that I would not be dealing with fiscal issues. And that was, in fact, I think, a deliberate disclaimer on my part to avoid engaging in deeply with a particularly difficult, with a particularly complex topic, which is fiscal federalism. But I think this volume demonstrates why that avoidance is problematic, because it is commonly avoided in the literature regarding diversity management. Fiscal arrangements are central, but a surprisingly understudied dimension of diversity management. There is, I think, ample disputes over resources, which often underlined by or exacerbated or aggravated communal tensions in many parts of the world, and I think especially in federal systems. And one can think of, I mean, the cases mentioned in the book, including Quebec in Canada, the more recent secessionist sentiments in Alberta, or the sort of the long-standing conflicts in Nigeria's oil-producing regions. So disputes over resources underlie many of these communal tensions. But despite this reality, the literature on fiscal federalism has often approached, I think, the subject primarily from the perspective of economic efficiency and governance. So fiscal federalism is typically sort of analyzed as sort of rules and mechanisms that are sort of aimed at improving the allocation of resources, ensuring a well-functioning of public finances. But what this book does, I think, is, and what makes it, I think, particularly valuable is that it examines fiscal arrangements through the lens of diversity management. It explores, as it also indicated in the book, how intergovernmental fiscal relations can have both integrative and disintegrative effects in diverse, deeply divided societies. I think in that sense, I think the book fills an important, it fills an important gap in the comparative federalism literature. And I think in that sense, it's also a cutting edge because, as I said, so far the work has only focused on sort of examining set of fiscal related rules from the perspective of economic efficiency and governance, but not from the perspective of how it affects or is affected by issues related to diversity management. So that said, I think reading the book from the perspective of someone who is primarily interested in sort of diversity accommodation from constitutional law or from political science perspective, I mean, reading was not always, I think, straightforward. Yes, some chapters were quite technical. While this may not be a problem for, I think, for a specialist in fiscal federalism, but for readers approaching the topic from a constitutional law or political science perspective, may find some of the discussion difficult to follow. And at times, I think for me, some of the chapters read like sort of the conventional analysis of fiscal federalism in a particular country, with the question of diversity only coming sort of towards the end of the discussion. But that, again, sort of raises the question whether this book, sort of this important contribution, is it an important contribution in the literature on fiscal federalism or on the literature on diversity management? And I think a careful examination of the book shows that it does represents an important contribution in both areas. So in reality, it actually sits somewhere between the two major areas of study. And I think one of the valuable insights that emerges, I think, from several chapters in the book is that fiscal arrangements are inherently dynamic, that they cannot be solved once and for all through a single constitutional rule or through a single institutional design. So socioeconomic changes, shifting political demands, and also evolving regional inequalities, I mean, require continuous renegotiations, continuous adaptation. So, and I think Alicia earlier mentioned, I think, and that comes out clearly in the book, is that the paradox of fiscal agreements is that any balance that is reached at particular in time might actually be temporary in nature, because sooner or later it might give rise to new intergovernmental tensions, new intergovernmental conflicts. So that, I think, it comes out very clearly through the cases, and also in the concluding chapter, that fiscal arrangements are inherently and unavoidably dynamic. Let me also sort of briefly, I think, raise a few additional specific observations. First, I think I wondered about the decision in the book to begin with a chapter on asymmetric fiscal arrangement rather than with the country case studies following the introduction. if the argument is that fiscal responses to diversity management are commonly asymmetric, I think either I have missed that, or that should have been stated more clearly. Otherwise, I would have thought that it would have worked better if the sort of the asymmetric chapter, which is a thematic chapter, if it followed the empirical case studies. One thing that I also, another issue that I also sort of wondered was that whether the case studies follow or followed a common sort of template. And there is always a debate about whether sort of edited volumes should impose a structure or should just be left to the contributors. To me, I think some degree of consistency, I think, can make it easier for readers sort of to compare experiences across federations, but also for the editors who have to write, who have to provide a comparative observation chapter at the end of the book, as this book does. And I think that's also, in that respect, I think I really would like to commend the editors, I think, for the concluding comparative chapter, because despite, I think for me, despite the diversity of approach followed by the contributors, the editors have succeeded in drawing out a number of important comparative insights in the areas of, I think, in areas that matter for fiscal arrangement and in diversity management. So in participation in fiscal decision making, in the independence of the revenue base, as well as in the design of intergovernmental transfer. And I think they really bring in very insightful comparative observations from the contributors, but also I think from beyond the contributors. Some of the points raised in the comparative chapter may not be necessarily available in the chapters, which I have noticed in some of the cases. And I think so that says a lot to the work that has been done by the editors. Perhaps maybe let me just say a few things by focusing on issues to explore further. Issues I think for me arise from my reading of the book. Now, for me, one of the sort of interesting question could be that raised by the book concerns the nature of diversity itself, I think. And the question is, does the type of diversity matter for fiscal federalism? Are fiscal solutions different when diversity stems from cultural or linguistic differences, as opposed to diversity that comes from socioeconomic inequalities? I think this is a question that sort of deserves, I think, further exploration. And I think the other point is that the book, which I think comes out clearly right from the early pages, from the foreword and from the introduction, throughout the case and into the concluding chapter, is that cultural claims often conceal or hide economic claims. In other words, identity-based demands may frequently be rooted actually in a struggle over resources. I think that's what Francesco calls the elephant in the room in his sort of introductory remarks. I think this is a powerful argument, and it would be interesting to explore whether there are cases where cultural conflicts have been resolved without some form of fiscal accommodation. And I think establishing this would, I think, reinforce or not the claim that cultural claims often conceal economic claims, or underlying any cultural identity-related claims are often also resource-related claims. So it would be interesting to see whether there were cases where sort of identity-related disputes have been resolved without some form of fiscal accommodation, without some form of resort to fiscal arrangements. Finally, I think I want to say that the book raises a very important point about the power dynamics embedded, the power of dynamics that's embedded in fiscal relations. dependence on transfers from another level of government may have an assimilating or diversity eroding effect. And I think this insight highlights the extent to which fiscal arrangements can shape political relations, societal relations within federations. So let me conclude by saying that although I approached the book with some initial hesitation, reading it, I think, reinforced my conviction that fiscal arrangements are an essential dimension of diversity and management. And I think by bringing together these two areas of scholarships, two huge areas of scholarship, which is fiscal federalism and the constitutional accommodation of diversity, I think the book opens an important and productive conversation. And for that reason, I think it makes a valuable contribution to the comparative study of federalism. Congratulations again, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Yonatan, for all your comments and remarks. I'm not sure whether the editors would prefer to react to the comments raised by our discussants immediately, or maybe we could collect a few questions from the audience. I don't know, what do you think? Maybe since we are running a bit short on time, we could perhaps take one or two final questions from the audience and then have a single round of answers from the editors. What do you think, Alice and Francisco? Okay, so if you want to ask question, please use, I can see already the virtual hand of Giuseppe, but if you want to ask question, please raise your virtual hand and I will give you the floor. So Giuseppe, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for this very fascinating presentation and the change of thoughts. So, I mean, I think that's the editors that will benefit enormously from the comments and questions raised by the discussant. So, I mean, thanks so much. I think this is a very important book, which definitely confirms the fundamental role, I mean, played by indeed fiscal and economic dynamics in the life of federal system. So I would like to build upon to what Yonatan mentioned when highlighting once more the connection between asymmetry and intergovernmental relations as something that also characterizes, I mean, this ambit as well. So my question that for you, I know it's a very general question, but I think it is something that you address in your book after these important comparative reports. How would you define the breaking point where fiscal federalism starts to pull a system apart instead of integrating it? I think this is an important issue because we can find here, we can encounter here some counter arguments that are frequently evoked against asymmetry. So I mean, again, these are twin concepts in a way. So I'm curious to know how would you address this macro question in light of the comparative experiences that you managed to gather in this very important volume. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Giuseppe. So if there are, okay, we have Giacomo. So Giacomo, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alice, Francisco, all the authors and the discussants for the points you have raised. My question has to do with the issue of participation, sub-state participation in the management of financial relations. This is unfinished business in Italy, and it's an object of contention in many jurisdictions. If you were asked to let's say, provide a few guidelines. So how would what red line would you point to when it comes to, let's say, designing participation? Since you also highlight the relevance of financial relations as a tool for conflict management. So what would be your, let's say, your guidelines? Thanks.
Thank you, Giacomo. I don't see. Okay, we have another question. Yeah, I can see you. Noah, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, hi. I want to thank you, first of all, for the discussion. It's been super interesting so far. My question just stems out of curiosity because unfortunately I haven't had the time to read fully the book. I have some homework to do. But referring to the balance affair you mentioned first in your structure of the discussion, Alice, across the case studies that you analyze, under your view, which case study best accommodates this balance between autonomy and solidarity? And it's addressed to both you, Alice and Francisco, if you have something to say about that. Thank you.
So I thank you very much now for your question. I don't know if there are other questions. Otherwise, I will apply self-restraint, and I'm not gonna ask a question by myself because we are really running out of time. So I will give back the floor to the editors, and I will say that you have more or less 88 minutes for each for answering the question, comments, and so on. Okay, so I don't know if Francisco or Alice want to start with the...
Yeah, I can start. Okay, so thank you, Matteo. Thank you for all the questions. I will make this a bit difficult for Alice because I will address some of the questions and then I will leave the rest to her. But I can unfortunately not, I think, address all the comments and questions that have been raised because they simply were too much. No, thank you to discussants, to Maribel and to Yonatan for their comments, and thank you also all of you for your questions. I'll try to connect some of the reflections in order to address them in one go. So regarding the structure of the book that Yonatan mentioned, we gave the authors let's say set of guidelines. Unfortunately, not all of them followed as much as we would have probably loved. But we tried to, let's say, frame the debate in a way that they needed to identify a type of diversity in very broad terms, and then they needed to connect how fiscal federalism interlinked with that diversity. And yeah, Yonatan perfectly pointed out one of the main challenges of this book, that is that it moves between two disciplines. So some authors would focus more on the pure fiscal federalism part, other on the constitutional law part. Actually, one of the difficulties that we experienced in this book was that it was very difficult to find authors that would be willing to address the challenge of combining these two perspectives. The good news is that we always had the idea of editing another book. So now, with your reflections, probably we have a direction to follow, and we know who to call. Saying that to give you also the challenge, but it was one of the difficulties. We know that fiscal federalism is an essential part of federal systems, and when I tried to start this project, it was because of the acknowledgement of that issue, and the acceptance that I could not disregard it. So even if I was not at the beginning thrilled by the idea of having to study fiscal federalism, I realized that this needed to be done, and this project was a good moment to do it. Of course, diversities can be very different, and probably, the type of diversity probably matter, I would say. And this is, those diversities that are more linked to, let's say, cultural, identitarian issues, like it can be language, for instance. I think probably the way of addressing those diversities and the role that fiscal federalism plays is probably different to when the diversity addresses from different financial situations. However, my alternative question would be, can we isolate one and the other? Because sometimes we find them connected. And you mentioned the preface of Francesco, and it's for me very difficult to find a successful system of accommodation of territorial diversity that one way or another is not linked to money. So even if we think, for the example of Italy, of the case of South Tyrol, the diversity was originally because of language and because of other factors, but this autonomy, the success of this autonomy cannot be understood without the broad financial autonomy that the province has. And let's say the advantageous financial situation that the province has. And well, Maribel would probably immediately think if this could be, we could separate financial issues from identitarian politics in Catalonia or in the Basque Country. But continuing with this, I think Maribel mentioned this, that the distribution of resources is of course linked to the idea that we have of what the welfare state should be. So in other words, how much we value solidarity, how much we value horizontal solidarity. So I think this is important. And another question that was mentioned is the importance of sub-state participation. This is something that we have explored, identifying, let's say, 4 different paradigms of sub-state participation. And I would not be so adventurous of giving a solution for Italy, because we have things that work and things that don't work. And some things that work, I must admit, I'm not a fan of. I'm not a fan of bilateral negotiations, but I admit that for the special regions, they work. What I think is that intergovernmental dialogue is necessary, and that this needs to be, let's say, the starting conditions should be equal. So the regions and the subnational entities and the states should be in an equal position at the start of this intergovernmental dialogue. And therefore, there should not be for the state to decide almost alone. Because in the end, this empties the intergovernmental dialogue, I would say. Of course, at some point, probably bilateral negotiations are important to negotiate some particular aspects that would not, that would only affect a certain territory, but this should not be, let's say, this should not be to the exclusion of multilateral dialogue. Also, tailor-making systems to adapt a specific territory, I think this has not worked in practice, and in Spain, we know this very well, because this leads in one way or another to confrontation and to the dissatisfaction by other territories. The problem is that practice is very different to theory, so we can try to come with very good ideas, but then the political actors will prove us wrong in one way or another. And with this, I give the floor to Alice, and I'm sure that she can also address some of these issues.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Francisco, for leaving me the most difficult ones. Just I noted down a few comments on which I want to just give some feedback. But first of all, I would like to thank the discussant for the inputs you gave us, that are, of course, all very welcome and much appreciated, because they're very important food for thought to us. I would like to focus on 2, maybe 3 points. So one is the question that Giuseppe asked us about, where is the breaking point? So in theory, as Francisco mentioned, it's easy, more in theory than in practice. Because when we investigated this issue related to participation in fiscal decision-making, so in setting the rules of the game, in changing them, we find out that a system is successful, so participation in a way is functioning if contestation are there. So contestation exists because they belong to the nature of things, and these are inherent to this dynamic nature that someone likes so much of financial relations, but it's there, so we cannot avoid that. But as long as contestation are done resorting to legitimate tools, constitutionalized tools, or anyway system that are within the constitutional boundaries, this is fine. So this is not overcoming the breaking point. I make you an example that always is fascinating to me, because what happens in Germany is that every financial equalization law has been always approved by unanimity within the Bundesrat, even if unanimity is not required, just majority is required. But what happens next is that all equalization schemes have been challenged in front of the Federal Constitutional Court. So is this contestation within the boundaries? Is this the breaking point? In our perception, this is within the boundaries, because it doesn't challenge the integrity of the system. This is our definition, but then we can test it if it works or not in different case studies. It doesn't challenge the integrity of the federal system, and it doesn't challenge the existence of equalization. It just challenges the way equalization functions and works in a given moment. So as long as this is like not a pathology, but within the physiology of the system, one could say, then we are within the what you, Giacomo, asked about the guidelines. There are no guidelines, but it remains within the constitutional boundaries, and it's somehow accepted, and it's functional in the dynamics within these fiscal balances. If it goes beyond, we have some issues, and so it comes to other guidelines for this participation. No, there aren't, I'm sorry, and we can struggle even to compare all existing case studies and then try to identify some recurring traits that allow us to say, okay, these are a sort of guidelines, but we have to be honest and say that this is very much context specific. For instance, thinking about the Canadian provinces. So intergovernmental relations in Canada are informal. So they're not structured, institutionalized as in Australia. And when it comes to, for instance, interesting enough, the provinces are consulted, and they're often consulted. But when it comes to equalization, then they are consulted in a way, but then the final say remains always with the federal government, that sometimes has decided to extend the program without not calling for the meeting, the federal provinces, the meeting between the federal government and the provincial government. So is this within or outside the boundaries? Is this within the guidelines that you are calling about? So it's very difficult. It's something that is also linked to, for instance, in Canada, the federal culture. So how the system in practice has adapted and evolved over time in order to secure effectiveness in terms of participation. So it's difficult to set a list of features that need to be there, otherwise there is no participation. Still, as you mentioned, there are cases in which it's very weak, and these are cases to be observed closer, because here we can find these breaking points maybe more easily, and then see if this is due to participation weaknesses or to other matters. Because of course, as we said, participation as a role but it's not the only determinant in this equilibrium. So again, always to look at the entire picture. And here comes to the question about the best balance. Unluckily, we do not have a best balance. We do not have a system that has to be preferred, confronted to another or compared to another. When I was talking about, I would theoretically have expected a system that is more fiscally centralized instead of fiscally decentralized. I was referring to the fact that theoretically, when I talk about having identity-related diversity that are also territorially concentrated and there are linked to so many diversities that overlaps and are linked to rich entities, I would expect that together with the claim for more autonomy, they also attach the claim for more fiscal autonomy. But this is completely theoretical, and at the end of the day, each balance in terms of financial arrangement is unique, and it's again the one that it's valid until it is changed. This is also interesting, and this is also a challenge and an opportunity if we connect this to diversity accommodation, because again, if there is a link between diversity accommodation and fiscal federalism, of course, the fact that this fiscal balance changes also frequently, it's like, of course, an opportunity to claim for diversity accommodation in a different way, but might also be a challenge because as the system changes, the previous accommodation could have been more accommodating of the existing diversity than it is the new one, because the new one could be subject to new dynamics, especially to a new political compromise that is linked to the momentum, to the government of the day. So this might be also a risk for diversity accommodation.
Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you very much, Francisco, and thank you very much all for this engaging discussion. Before we conclude, I would like to thank again our speakers of today and to congratulate again Francisco and Alice on the publication of this fantastic book. Let me read again the title: Fiscal Federalism and Diversity Accommodation in Multilevel States, a Comparative Outlook. Let me say that I fully agree with the editors. The book opens new paths for research and raises very interesting points from a comparative perspective. So I truly and fully recommend it. Thank you again for joining us today, and I hope to see you soon at future STALS events. Thank you.